In July of 2022, Sri Lankan citizens stormed and occupied the Republic's presidential palace after months of demonstrations. The protesters had one main demand: for the country's then-president Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign. You see, Sri Lanka was in the middle of a crippling economic crisis, the worst the country had seen since it claimed independence in 1948. As a result, the island nation's people struggled to get their hands on essential goods like fuel, food, and medicine.
It is now synonymous with the worst economic crisis in this country in decades.
And while some factors leading to the country's financial mess were out of the government's control, political analysts largely agree it was ultimately some major policy missteps from Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his powerful family that caused Sri Lanka's economic demise. So, what do we know about the Rajapaksa family, and how did we get here? In June 2022, an investor sued Sri Lanka after the developing nation defaulted on its debt for the first time in history. In its lawsuit filed in a New York federal court, Hamilton Reserve Bank accused the ruling Rajapaksa clan of orchestrating the country's default. For more than 70 years, the Rajapaksa dynasty has played a key role in Sri Lanka's post-independence politics. A part of southern Sri Lanka's rural elite, the family held numerous local and regional government roles over the decades. However, it wasn't until the 21st century that the Rajapaksas rose to the national stage. Not one, but two members of the family were elected to the highest office in the land. Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was president from 2005 to 2015, and his younger brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was president from 2019 until he abandoned his office in July 2022.
Everywhere you pass huge billboards glorifying President Rajapaksa as Sri Lanka's saviour.
The brothers kept their relatives close. During Mahinda Rajapaksa's second term in office, more than 40 members of the Rajapaksa clan were in government. Similar displays of nepotism took place during Gotabaya's presidency, with a third of Sri Lanka's 28 ministries headed by members of the family. Now, it's worth mentioning Sri Lanka has a history of influential families running the nation. The Bandaranaikes, for instance, produced one president and 3 prime ministers. But we're here to discuss the Rajapaksas and the decisions that tanked Sri Lanka's economy. The current economic crisis is complicated, but can essentially be traced back to 2 main causes: huge piles of debt and shrinking foreign currency reserves. Let's start by looking at Sri Lanka's enormous debts. In May 2022, the country defaulted on $51 billion of foreign debt. It was the first time a country in the Asia-Pacific region had failed to keep up with repayments since Pakistan in 1999, according to credit rating agency Moody's. External debt has more than quadrupled since the Rajapaksas first came to power in 2005, growing from about $11 billion to more than $50 billion, of which around $38 billion was long-term debt. Its origins came from what some considered the family's biggest success, the end of Sri Lanka's devastating civil war. More than 100,000 people died in the nearly 3-decade-long conflict, and most citizens were happy to see its end.
We in Sri Lanka are stepping into a new era of peace, stability, and renewed economic opportunities.
The country needed to rebuild, and Mahinda's ambitions were big. In 2007, 2 years before the end of the Civil War, the government launched a 10-year plan to invest in infrastructure developments, such as power, ports, and roads. One way Sri Lanka raised money was by borrowing from international investors, starting with its $500 million bond issue in 2007. This is similar to a country handing out IOUs, which pay interest in exchange for hard cash. These bonds were sold in exchange for dollars, leaving Sri Lanka needing to swap its rupees for the US currency when the time came to make payments. All well and good with enough foreign currency in its reserves, but a potential disaster if not. More on this later. With its high returns, Sri Lanka's bond issue was 3.2 times oversubscribed, raising $1.6 billion from 136 investors. It was the first installment of a borrowing binge that would later come to haunt the country, with Sri Lanka racking up 14 international sovereign bond issues in 15 years. While rating agencies consider the country's earlier bond issues generally stable, this wasn't to last. A year after the Civil War drew to a close in 2009, the IMF upgraded its assessment of Sri Lanka to a middle-income emerging market. While this upped its borrowing credentials with many lenders, the achievement limited the country's access to financing from institutions like the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, which offer loans below the market rate. Still, foreign money poured into the country as investor confidence grew, including heavy investments by money managers on Wall Street. Sri Lanka's newfound peace and capital appealed to voters, and Mahinda Rajapaksa was re-elected president in 2010. But it was becoming clear that the Civil War resolution was far from a clean victory. International organizations released reports of alleged war crimes and human rights abuses during the conflict.
Have you actually held the independent inquiry? Has it begun? And in what form is it independent?
I'm sorry, but
when you
we
say
don't have to have so-called independent inquiries into any Tom, Dick and Harry allegation.
In response, many Western governments stopped sending foreign aid Sri Lanka's way, and that stream of income began to dry up. Mahinda Rajapaksa was undeterred and instead turned to China to fund his extravagant and expensive, quote, vanity projects, such as ports and an expanded central business district in the capital, Colombo. China became the country's largest foreign direct investor in 2013, accounting for nearly a quarter of its inflows. In the same year, China launched its wide-ranging infrastructure strategy, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been criticized for its lending practices to poorer countries. Its loans tend to have higher interest rates and shorter repayment periods than those given by Western governments and institutions. It's also been hesitant to provide debt relief for countries struggling to keep up with repayments on interest-bearing loans.
China is not the main source of the crisis, although there's a big debt trap narrative going around.
For a better understanding of how Sri Lanka's debt is split up, let's look at this IMF report that was released in March of 2022. The country's long-term external debt in 2020 stood at $38.7 billion, or 48.2% of its annual GDP. The largest chunk of debt was owed to international sovereign bondholders such as BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, and HSBC. Multilateral lenders like the Asian Development Bank formed the next largest group of lenders, holding $8.8 billion of debt. China was owed $5 billion, Japan around $3.5 billion, while debts to India amounted to around $800 million. Mahinda Rajapaksa failed to win a third term as president in 2015, but his shadow still loomed large over the next cash-strapped government. And it wouldn't be long before the Rajapaksas were once again running the show. Mahinda was appointed prime minister briefly in 2018 and again in 2019, after his younger brother Gotabaya was elected president. Gotabaya Rajapaksa's rise followed in the wake of a series of terror attacks on Easter Sunday in April 2019. The bombings targeted 3 luxury hotels and 3 churches, killing 267 people. Gotabaya Rajapaksa's platform of tighter security policies and tax cuts resonated deeply with voters and won him the election. Shortly after he assumed office, he made good on his campaign promise to slash taxes, a vow we now know reduced the number of taxpayers by 1 million. This was a massive problem for a country already struggling with widespread tax evasion. And then the pandemic happened. Tourism, which made up 5.6% of Sri Lanka's GDP in 2018, and contributed revenues of $4.4 billion plunged to just 0.8% in 2020. Remittances from Sri Lankan workers abroad fell by 22.7% in 2021.
The COVID shock has affected growth, it's affected tourism, which then has an impact on how much they will, have in terms of FX money. Then it has a spillover effect on public finances, and the public debt is already very high.
The government was spending a lot more than it was earning. By 2020, the three main rating agencies had downgraded Sri Lanka's bond offerings to junk status, signaling the country was at higher risk of default. This was a major turning point because it meant the country could no longer go to international markets to borrow money. For years, it had been paying off old debt with new debt. This made that much more difficult.
How committed and how confident are you that you would be able to honor your debt commitments?
We are 100% committed and we are confident.
This is where Sri Lanka's shrinking foreign reserves come in. Foreign reserves are the foreign assets a central bank holds, such as gold or US dollars. Having these assets helps central banks keep their region's currency and economy stable. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka's reserves were running low for several reasons. 1. The decline in tourism. Fewer visitors were swapping their home currencies for the local rupee. 2. Waning remittances, a big loss because these were sent home in foreign currency as well. 3. A heavy dependence on imports. Paying for these goods from abroad also requires foreign currency, usually US dollars. 4. Propping up the Sri Lankan rupee. The government kept its currency value up by buying it themselves, using foreign reserves. And 5. Foreign debt. Loan repayments also require foreign exchange. At this point, many countries go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. But the Rajapaksa's ultra-nationalist agenda was at odds with this option. Seeking help from the IMF and the austerity measures that come along with it was seen as undermining Sri Lankan sovereignty. Instead, the Rajapaksas went directly to countries like India, China, Bangladesh, and Australia for loans, as well as trying other homegrown solutions.
Is that really a sustainable solution?
Absolutely. Because if you don't have the ability to go to the markets right now and the prices are high and there is a dearth of funds out there, then you got to find alternative sources.
The government began restricting supposed non-essential imports like fish, footwear, and wine in an attempt to protect its foreign reserves. But this caused shortages and pushed up prices. The cost of food has nearly doubled, and overall inflation now tops 60%. The war in Ukraine also drove up energy prices, making it even more difficult for the nation to import fuel. Long lines formed at petrol stations and daily power cuts became the norm for the country's 22 million people.
How long have you been waiting in this queue?
I'm waiting 4 days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like that. I am buying for 3 liters for 1,500 rupees. How can I drive?
The president also banned chemical fertilizers and pesticides in April 2021, forcing millions of farmers to use organic methods instead. This move proved disastrous for crops. Rice production fell by 20% 6 months after the ban was introduced. Production of tea, the country's top export, fell by 18%. This worsened the food shortage, and with exports down, Sri Lanka also lost a valuable way to replenish its foreign reserves. Gotabaya Rajapaksa did U-turn eventually and gave in to entering debt relief talks with the IMF. But it was too late. Forced to decide between making payments to foreign lenders and importing crucial goods, the country defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history 2 months later.
There is gridlock and there is misgovernance and incompetence reigning in our country, and 22 million people are suffering.
Sri Lankans were furious. More than 2/3 of families were struggling to get food on the table, all while allegations were swirling about the Rajapaksas siphoning off billions of dollars for themselves. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned in July 2022. Unfortunately, the nation's problems won't disappear along with the powerful family. The country's 9th president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, isn't the fresh start many Sri Lankans were hoping for, due to his close associations with his predecessor. But if Sri Lanka wants to overcome its economic obstacles, experts say what the nation needs most now is stability. Without it, there is always the possibility that the Rajapaksas could claw their way back into power.